things that I want by Max Payne. A smoke, a whiskey, for the sun to shine. I want to sleep to forget, to change the past. My wife and baby girl back. Unlimited ammo and a license to kill.
I believe that quote sums up the torture and pain of Max Payne, a character whose prime existence is all about suffering. He's walking revenge for the hell he's forced to come to terms with and live through every single day. That hell, his personal hell, is that he survived an attack on his home when his wife and newborn daughter did not. Most people know of Max as a sad, depressed drunk who, after years of being unable to come to terms with his past, developed a crippling addiction to alcohol and painkillers. Someone who had nothing else going for him in his life, so he decided to start withering away in random bars in New Jersey, opting to slowly kill himself rather than either make one more final attempt at living life or going out and facing one of the many enemies that he undoubtedly created over the last decade or so. As Max got older, his grief and anger began to consume him more and more, creating a vicious cycle of scarfing down pills with the help of copious amounts of alcohol. What's fascinating about Max is, despite all the struggles of addiction, amidst his personal turmoil, his swift eye and even faster trigger finger makes him the perfect man to unleash hell like no other. Through all his drunken benders and sloppy hangovers, his swift eye and even faster trigger finger couldn't be slowed. Few, if any, could bring this gifted killer down. Hordes of heavily armed mobsters, trained killers, or government personnel were all unable to do the very thing Max possibly wanted more than anything in the world: to finally be killed. Now, I've heard many say the Max we get in Max Payne 3 is not the same as the Max from the two previous games. Max is more rigid, he's more pessimistic, he doesn't have the same poetic way with words as he had before. He's much darker and prone to cursing. Others say the third game completely disregards the second, when that game ended with Max seemingly coming to terms with the death of his family. The final quote of Max Payne 2 is actually,
I had a dream of my wife. She was dead, but it was all right.
Using that as an isolated example, the third game supposedly does force Max to start suffering from the pain and anguish he had already come to terms with, hence creating the idea that this is really nothing more than Rockstar's writing taking over the direction of the character. By making his wife and daughter the same origins of his pain and self-loathing, it becomes a much more compelling story on this cycle of Max struggling to properly cope. And while some argument can still be made there, I do want to point out that with that logic, the second game technically disregards the events of the first game. The entire story of the first game is a complete 180, Max transitioning from becoming a family man, making his family his one and only priority, to then, after his wife and daughter is killed, dedicating his career, his primary focus now, to avenging the death of his loved ones. He transfers from being an NYPD detective to becoming a DEA agent and putting together a case on the same street drug his wife and daughter's murderers were under the influence of when they committed the crime. He leaves behind an entire trail of bodies throughout New York City, becoming a fugitive DEA agent wanting for a murder that he was framed for, making him a prime target of NYPD, while also going through the Punchinello crime family, who's aware that he is a cop. Wanted by both sides of the law, Max does eventually become successful in his objective, bringing the person responsible for the death of his family to street justice. The first game concludes with Max surrendering himself to NYPD with a smile on his face, saying he's a little bit closer to heaven. It may not be full-on closure, but it's a step in the right direction. After 3 years of making little to no progress, tortured by nightmares of his inability to keep his loved ones safe, now he can somewhat rest easy or go down the path of healing with the person responsible 6 feet under. Fast forward to the prologue of Max Payne 2, he acknowledges that he lied to himself. He thought it was all over, but in fact it wasn't. His loved ones were still dead and he was still breathing. The trilogy as it is a tale of Max's never-ending cycle of self-pity and self-hatred. Feeling responsible for the death of his loved ones, Max saw himself as a failure, incapable of protecting his family. He would then go on to lose his job as an NYPD detective as a result of his actions during the first 2 games, and now at the age of 46 years old around the time of the third game, with no career to invest himself in anymore, no love interest or anything else, really, what can you expect? He's at the mercy of his own demons. There's nothing else to preoccupy himself with, to become pessimistic, bitter, and ultimately the addict that we see him as in the third game. Getting completely shit-faced is all he can look forward to, if we can even say that is something to look forward to at all. But to really cover Max's internal struggle we must go back to the events of the first game to really understand the hardship that he suffered. We must go back to the year of 1998. Max is living what he can only describe as his American dream. A house, a beautiful wife, and a 6-month-old baby girl. Now, it's not said in this game, but I think it's worth noting, Max had only known his wife Michelle for a short period of time. Max and Michelle got married only 6 months after they first met. 9 months later, their daughter Rose was born. This is showed in the comic books. Yes, Rockstar actually released a comic book for Max Payne around the release of Max Payne 3. But getting married in such a short amount of time and having a baby immediately after, I think it's safe to say Max was more than taken over by Michelle. 6 months after that, in August of 1998, at the start of the first game, Max is preparing to be a full-on family man. He rejects an offer to come work at the DEA, saying they just put him working undercover in some hellhole. His wife and daughter come first. He's not willing to put himself in a position where he'll either get hurt or potentially killed, leaving his wife and daughter to put together the pieces of their now shattered life. Max goes on to then celebrate his last cigarette, exclaiming it's bad for the baby, and he heads home. Considering the information of their relatively quick marriage is information left to a comic that most people don't really know about, and our first introduction to Max becoming family first, career second is showed to us in the very first time we're even introduced to Max. It's difficult to really understand the position he's in now. Full family mode, enjoying the life of settling down, eventually sinking deeper and deeper into his pit of despair. Once his perfect life and his very bright future was ripped away from him. In 1998, he really was living his dream with his dream girl. He said himself he loved Michelle with every fiber of his being. A few days after burying his dead loved ones, Max focused his life on utilizing his career as a way to avenge his wife and daughter. Not only doing a complete 180, joining the DEA, and spearheading the drug case, fighting the manufacturing and distribution of Valkyr, on the outside it seems like a very noble thing to do. The best way to honor the memory of his slain loved ones and make sure those responsible actually see justice. I think if the story was described as that way, anyone would feel empathy for Max. I think they would also see the honor and beauty in now technically dedicating your career to them. It seems beautiful on the outside, but deep down, the game shows that Max is actually a man that's always been struggling to properly cope. As the game progresses, Max experiences a few nightmares. While these nightmares are terrifying on their own, they indicate just how Max thinks about the entire ordeal. He's placed back to that fateful day, where his house is ransacked. The hallways he's running down become dizzyingly long. Basic movement and jumps lack any kind of weight or accuracy to them, all while his baby girl wails in agony in the background, which you have to pinpoint and follow in order to actually wake up from the nightmare. To this day, those nightmare sequences are unnerving. The music, the crying, following the very strict blood trail. If you move slightly too much to the left or right, Max will fall and die. It's insight to forcing himself to try and to accept what happened, while simultaneously acknowledging it's a horrible dream that he can't wake up from, that he can't escape it. Throughout these dream sequences, there's other clues and insights to Max's life before everything happened, from his partnership and close friendship with Alex Balder, the man who offered him the position within the DEA, the same man whose death Max was framed for. It's another nightmare and terrible loss that's constantly overshadowed with him acknowledging he can't handle the loss of his own family. During these dream sequences, Max says himself, he adopted a rule. If you don't think about something, it can never have happened. Sure, it may work when he's awake, committing himself to the point of exhaustion on bringing his family's killers to justice, but here, subconsciously, he cannot escape. All his regrets, his broken promises, his unlimited number of what-ifs, scenarios of things that have been done or said differently, time that wasn't spent, time that he can't get back, memories he can't get back. These dreams may very well have been amplified by Max's exposure to Valkyr, but at the start of the first nightmare he says the nightmares are always the same. And if we look at the differences between the two nightmares he goes through, the premise is ultimately still the same. He still gets brought back to that fateful day. His house is always a funhouse decorated with the anguishing memories of his family's passing, and his failure to either protect them or move past what had happened to them. Max may not have been an addict quite yet, but he's clearly running from his past. A past that came back with a vengeance once some closure, or at least the idea of it, was dangled in front of him. Once he finally began to make progress in the Valkyr drug case, finding the complicated scheme behind his family's intentional assassination, this pain, anger, and self-pity that was constantly directed inward was now unleashed and fully directed outward, something he was on some level aware of. Towards the end of the first game, when he discovers a shelved government project known as Project Valhalla, which is essentially the origins of the drug Valkyr. The drug started off as a government project to enhance soldiers' physical capabilities with the hope of boosting their stamina, endurance, and capacity to endure severe pain such as gunshots. The program turned out to be disappointing when the results were less than desirable though. Not only was the experimental drug highly addictive, but under high doses, subjects suffered hallucinations and partial or total mental deterioration. Max's wife came dangerously close by accident to learning of the program's illegal continuation by Nicole Horn, head of the Aesir pharmaceutical company. So, in an effort to keep her illegal doings under wrap, Horn doubled the Valkyr dose for 3 test subjects under her custody and dropped them off at Max's house with the intention of assassinating everyone inside. Realizing it was all a hit job, Max tried to justify all the killing that he's been doing on some moral scale, but he knew everything he was doing was still his anger and rage boiling over. Max eventually kills Nicole Horn and believes he's a little bit closer to heaven. He can rest easy with his wife and daughter's killers feeding worms herself, but he was still tormented.
The past is a puzzle, like a broken mirror. As you piece it together and you cut yourself, your image keeps shifting, and you change with it.
Fast forward 2 years later to the beginning of Max Payne 2, Max has since then left the DEA. He was angry and disgruntled at the whole affair. Now he's working as an NYPD detective yet again, but he's clearly suffering from some kind of survivor's guilt. As I said earlier in this video, during the prologue of this game, he says that he convinced himself everything would be better, that it was all over, but it wasn't. He was still alive while his loved ones were dead. A notion that's later backed up through some tapped phone calls of his. Max falsely convinced himself killing Nicole Horn would make him feel better, but it did nothing but make him much more miserable. He was so miserable and lonely, in fact, that at one point he calls the sex line to just have someone listen to the pain he's suffering.
Thank you for calling Dangerous Liaisons. For Candy, press 1. For Sandy, press 2. For Mona, press 3. You press 3 for Mona. Hi, this is Mona. What's your name?
I just need someone to talk to.
Honey, this is a phone sex line. All we do is talk.
Right. How do you fix something like that? How do you make amends? I thought it would help, but it only made it worse.
Just give me your credit card number and I can listen to you all night.
Killing them all only made it worse. It didn't bring them back.
Hey, what are you, some kind of weirdo?
Sorry.
The ramblings of a broken man. Max has also since then moved out of his family home and into a dingy, seemingly low-rent apartment. Pizza boxes are thrown about everywhere, and it's barely furnished. He does have some valuables framed up, such as his photo with him and Alex Balder, or even Michelle. At first, you would think that he had just actually moved in, which you wouldn't be faulted for, but Max later admits some contracted killers have been spying on him in this apartment for weeks and possibly even months. It's evident he's in some deep kind of despair, but he's still functional. At the very least, he's still a gifted detective within the NYPD, one of the two crutches keeping him from completely imploding on himself. The other would be his love interest with Mona Sachs. Mona and Max have some small history. Back in 2001, during the first game, Max's rampage against the Punchinello crime family had him cross paths with Mona. She was a contracted killer who had her own reasons, both professional and personal, to see the head of the Punchinello family killed. They only had a few interactions, with Max still admitting to being interested in her for all of the wrong reasons. The last meeting between the two left Max thinking she was dead, as she received a special gift from Nicole Horn's hitman, that gift being a bullet to the head for refusing to kill Max. From there, Max never heard of Mona until 2003, when he was put on an entirely different case. The case involving a group of hitmen masquerading as a cleaning company. Now, here, a few years later, during 2003, Mona and Max's interest within each other is given a little more time and focus to blossom. The events of Max Payne 2 show the two of them falling for each other. They work together to handle some hits put out on them, with Mona refusing to go into any specifics, on the where, why, and how of what she knows and why she knows it. Eventually, it's revealed Mona, still being the contracted killer that she is, was supposed to kill Max, but she refused out of her feelings for him. Max, on the other hand, learned Mona had ties to Alfred Woden, the man who had sent Michelle the dossier of Nicole Horan's illegal doings back in 1998, which put the Payne's family life on a ticking clock, technically making Alfred Woden the one responsible for Michelle and Rose's death, and Mona was working for him with instructions to kill Max. Regardless of which, Max still ignores it. He still appears to fall in love with her, completely ignoring everything else, despite the realization of Mona's history and true intention for running into him again. The game concludes with Max kissing the dying Mona, who passes away not long after being shot. Later during Max Payne 3, while at the gravesite of Michelle and Rose, Max says he used Mona for grief. Considering the glimpses of Max's living condition and still somewhat struggling to come to terms with what happened to his wife and daughter, and Mona was his chance to be happy yet again, or at least that's the way he possibly saw it, he became completely enthralled with her. Max Payne 2 happens over the course of just a few days, so him to say he used Mona for grief, it does make some sense. It's not as if they spent months or weeks or years building a life together. It was a whirlwind, quote-unquote romance, if you want to call it that. He used her for emotional salvation when he was lonely and lost. Perhaps her ties to the days of him avenging his loved ones, or having a background where he would be better understood of the person that he is. A man who wouldn't be properly able to settle down with a regular woman like before. A man who has casted himself out to the side and completely isolated himself. Years of mental anguish and a body count as high as him, as he says, forced him to view reality through a different lens from many other people. Well, I think there can be a deep dive on Max and Mona as it is. For this video, it's possibly best to just go with what we're given, Mona being a coping mechanism. One that would cost Max his career. It was public knowledge Max was fraternizing with the enemy, at least that's how he put it. Mona was a fugitive wanted for the murder of a senator. Max refused to do his job and bring her in as an NYPD detective. It was also public knowledge during 2001, Max was responsible for the death of many high-ranking and low-level mafia members. Within the police department, the truth was known, but it was agreed between Max and his superior, Jim Bevora, that it was best to be removed of his position within law enforcement. Jim ensured Max was allowed a steady pension that was just enough for Max to drink himself numb in an apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. That is where Raul Passos found him.
Michelle, I missed her with every part of my being. I hated the world for not killing me with her, and I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl.
5 years of drinking himself numb. It's during this time Max would develop his addiction to painkillers and be completely at the mercy of his own demons. Max had no future, he had no career, no love interest, nowhere to go but face down in his own shit. Raul Passos, a man who claimed he knew Max from their days in the police academy together over a decade ago, managed to track him down in a beat-up bar in Hoboken, New Jersey. He came to Max with a job offer, a job that will take him 5,000 miles away from home, working as a private security detail for the Bronco family in Brazil. Max, having no recollection of the day before, let alone someone who claims he knew him over a decade ago, initially rejected the offer. He was far too busy feeling sorry for himself, hating himself every single day, forced to do nothing other than to replay all of his past failures. And anybody that's isolated themselves and really reflected, especially from a perspective where you blame yourself for everything that happened, it's quite a slippery slope to descend into. Max presumably had no one other than himself during these years, so it's years of hatred, of pity, of what ifs, feeling like a failure, nothing else to preoccupy himself with. It was an endless cycle that he was content living with. He tells Passos his days of being a good guy, his days of being a cop, of doing the right thing, of looking out for people, are long behind him. Not only does he spend countless of hours withering away at the bar, but if we go and take a look at his apartment, it's much worse than ever before. Countless alcohol bottles, trash everywhere, or perhaps more ominously, countless of firearms. During this game, when you move into Max's apartment, it's under attack, so gameplay-wise it makes a little sense why he has so many firearms, but if you walk inside the restroom, Max has a quote that gives a little insight to just how dark his mentality has really gotten.
I guess I thought if I was going to be shot in the face in here, it would probably be me pulling the trigger.
He yearns for death, the sweet release of it. He accepts the idea of it, as his life is nothing but miserable, but he's still not entirely suicidal. The whole reason Max ends up accepting the job offer of Raul Pasos is because Max ends up killing the son of Anthony DeMarco, head of the DeMarco crime family. This was a crime family that rose to prominence once the Punchinello family crumbled thanks to Max's doing the years before. Now, lacking the protection of being a cop and just killing a powerful mobster's son in broad daylight, Max fled the country with the new quote-unquote career path to look forward to. But just because he accepts this offer doesn't exactly mean he has turned over a new leaf. As his employers and his partner Raul Pasos see firsthand, Max is still very much battling his two addictions. He still hates himself more than ever. He's just brought his problems with him to an entirely different country. And this self-hatred slowly bleeds over to the people around him. Marcelo Branco, for instance, he can't stand. He considers him a moron. Yet what's interesting, despite everyone clearly seeing Max is still having his own problems and can't seem to put the bottle down, his opinion is still highly valued, even when his own addictions can be attributed to negligence on the job, specifically during a night out where Max is supposed to keep Fabiana Branco, the wife of Rodrigo Branco, the man that specifically signs off the paychecks of Max and Raul Pasos, her sister, and Rodrigo's little brother, all safe. Yet when Max reveals to Raul that Fabiana was kidnapped, he does also admit to drinking a little on the job. A minor incident, until you take into consideration that Max admits to Pasos he's not someone that's slipping, he's someone that has long since been slipped, and Raul sees the state of Max's apartment yet again, and him waking up with some of the nastiest hangovers ever, continuing to drink himself numb and masking the pain as much as he can. It's clear it's become a coping mechanism that Max just naturally gravitates to. As he says himself, he hates the world, himself, and everyone around him for just not being dead with his wife and daughter. So the man's still spiraling out of control after venturing halfway around the world and adopting an entirely different career, something to actually look forward to. What snapped Max out of it? What gave him the little closure to be able to move on, to be able to accept that he can't continue to live through the past, but instead come to terms with everything that happened and continue to move forward? Ironically, it came out of yet another failure. All this time, Max has been struggling to come to grips with him being just that, being incapable of keeping people around him safe. He's supposed to be a cop. He's supposed to be the protector of his wife, of his daughter, of his love interest. If we even go back to the comic books that Rockstar released with Max Payne 3, there's a little regret with being unable to even save his mother, who had her own addiction and struggles with alcohol. It's not until Fabiana was kidnapped, Max was incapable of rescuing her, and then once he rendezvous with Rodrigo to come up with another plan to initiate some kind of rescue mission, Rodrigo was assassinated on Max's watch. With Rodrigo dead, Fabiana's still in gang custody with no confirmation on whether if she's dead, if she's alive, if she's being tortured or not. Max realizes that he's still gonna die in this country, but he'd rather die in the country sober. Or as he says, if he's gonna die, he's gonna at least die as a pain in the ass. He shaves his head, he kicks his addiction to painkillers and alcohol as best as he tries, and now if he's not really suicidal, he's definitely got a death wish. He commits himself to saving Fabiana, doing his best to get to the bottom of who's behind targeting the Branco family while fighting a paramilitary group who has it out for him for killing a high number of their men for doing his job, protecting the Branco family. It was never a job he was fully invested in, but by way of failing again, instead of drinking himself numb, he snapped out of his depression. It wasn't the redemption or closure one can peacefully sleep with at night. However, after so much time of destroying himself physically and mentally, the decision to face the music, go guns blazing towards those after him, was possibly the only way he could have ever rose out of the slump he was in. It was his anger, his rage, his bad temper that helped him focus on something other than himself. It wasn't particularly a noble action or something that you can consider healthy, but it was something that still worked for him. At least that's when it comes to kicking his addiction. When it comes to coming to closure with his wife and daughter, it's really difficult to say exactly. As a point of reference, Max didn't even save Fabiana. In fact, she got a bullet to the head, taking him back to being at his wife and daughter's grave, remembering the hatred and anger he had for the world and himself. This is the last time he mentions his family throughout the entire game. Maybe it was him reflecting and realizing that people die. There's a quote later in the game when Max is going after the man responsible for the deaths of Rodrigo, as well as technically Fabiana and Marcelo. I believe the quote captures Max's awareness of how people around him tend to die, leaving him alone but allowing him to do what he does best: unleash death and destruction upon those that are most deserving of it.
Rodrigo, Giovanna, Passos, everyone who'd meant anything was gone. Like so many times before, I'd found myself alone, locked on a course of destruction. It was at my worst when I was at my best.
Max Payne 3 ends with Max watching Victor Bronco, the man responsible for the deaths of two of his brothers and the death of his sister-in-law. He met an even more humiliating end, found dead in a jail cell, either from a suicide or from street justice, as all of Victor's illegal doings, particularly involved in the wholesale trafficking of human organs, was brought to light. Max's story concludes with him walking down a beach, seemingly on some island somewhere, finally moving on from his grief and self-pity. We have yet to see an addition to Max's story here, so perhaps he finally did move on, maybe through the death of Victor and helping Passos escape with his pregnant girlfriend Giovanna. He was able to find some peace, knowing through all his personal pain and torment, he was at least able to bring some hope, some good, some salvation to the world and the people most in need around him.
The way I see it, there's two types of people. Those who spend their lives trying to build a future, and those who spend their lives trying to rebuild the past. For too long, I've been stuck in between, hidden in the dark,